Let me start. My name is Marja Spierenburg. I've joined the Institute of Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology in January last year. But I'm also the chair of the Scientific Advisory Council of the African Studies Center. So my linkages with the African Studies Center go back quite some time. So I'm very happy to be part of this panel. We will say a bit more about the panel after the introductions. But Harry, can I ask you to introduce yourself quickly?
Good afternoon to all. And my name is Harry Wells. I am 4 days a week at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam with the Department of Organization Sciences, and 1 day a week blessed at the African Studies Center, and happy to be on this panel as well. So thank you very much for joining. Beatrice.
You're registered as Jake Wright.
Okay. That's my boyfriend. I'm very sorry.
So now we know.
Yeah, he works also, and I'm very sorry. I don't know how to.
No, it doesn't matter at all.
I'm very sorry.
Can you introduce yourself briefly?
Okay. My name is Beatrice. I'm a first-year research master student of African Studies, and I'm very glad that I'm able to be present here, and I'm ready to learn. So, nice to meet you all.
Thank you.
Thanks. And you're also going to write a brief report on the panel.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Ton.
Yeah, my name is Ton Dietz, and I'm the co-organizer of this fascinating conference. Now almost ready. Next week is the last week. And then we have had 3 months, and I'm pleased to tell you that I've been there almost always. So I can see and I can compare how things are going. Very, very nice experience. Yeah.
Thanks, Ton. Samia.
Yes. Thank you very much. This is the first time that I get to introduce myself, so thank you. I'm Samia Chasi. I work in South Africa in higher education internationalization, currently for the International Education Association of South Africa. And I have worked in that bilateral cooperation space and international cooperation space for a really long time. One of the things that I did was setting up the first NAFIC office on the continent, in fact. And but my relationship with Harry, and I think also Ton, to some extent, goes back even further than that. But I am very fortunate that I was able to attend many sessions in this conference. As Ton said, I contributed. It wasn't planned, but it happened that way. The first blog to the conference website on decolonization and how it affects partnerships. So international practice in that sense. And yes, I'm delighted to be here. And I will apologize because I will have to sneak out a little bit earlier. There's another session today by the International Association of Universities that I've been asked to attend. So apologies.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining us. And of course, the other panel is very important. Fernanda.
I entered in 24, and I don't speak English very well.
Okay, but you can understand.
Yeah, I can understand. I can read, speak a little bit, but not partage my ideas. So, avec la facilité des autres.
Mais on peut, si vous avez quelque chose à dire, vous pouvez faire ça aussi en français.
Je peux le faire en français?
Oui.
Je préférais le faire dans ma langue maternelle, le créole du Cap-Vert, mais
Ah oui.
le français, c'est pas mal. Après le portugais, que c'est la langue officielle de mon pays. Je suis capverdienne. Je présenterai le 24. Je ne suis pas une académique de Racine. Plutôt, je n'ai pas eu du temps pour me dédier à l'académie pendant ma vie. J'ai fait le chemin du travail à l'éducation dans mon pays. Et après ça, après ma retraite, j'ai continué parce que pendant toute ma vie, j'ai eu beaucoup de curiosité sur les différentes logiques de développement, particulièrement le développement de l'éducation. Et j'arrive maintenant à avoir du temps pour être ici avec vous, apprendre pendant 3 mois presque. Je suis pas été tous les jours à toutes les sessions, mais j'ai beaucoup appris pendant le développement de ce séminaire. Et le 24, je vais essayer de partager en lisant en anglais de ma ligne d'investigation parce que je suis maintenant, je m'intitule investigateur indépendant, mais je suis correspondante du champ de du champ de la faculté de sciences humaines de l'université Nova du Portugal. Alors, je vais partager un peu ce que je pense et surtout, pendant ce temps, j'ai appris beaucoup. J'ai pris connaissance de beaucoup de choses que je ne connaissais pas.
Merci. So Fernanda is from
Obrigada, Beatriz.
yes, from Cape Verde. Yes, Portuguese also is possible from Cape Verde. Has always worked in education. I'm going to summarize a bit. And is now retired and has started to study again. So she's continuing her studies, mainly in the humanities and related to education. And she's affiliated to the University Nova in Portugal, if that's correct.
Yeah.
And has participated in a lot of panels and is also going to present in one of the panels that's still up. So thank you very much. Abir. Abir Abazid, if I pronounce it correctly. Abir, I think we will come back to you later. Erik. Oh, Abir is coming. Yeah.
Yeah.
This, Abir, can you hear us? I see that your microphone is on, but somehow I can't
hear nor see.
Yeah.
Yet.
Sorry, Abir. I'm going to go back to skip forward to Erik. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes. My name is Erik van der Zande, and I did a Master African Studies in Leiden 2 years ago. And at the moment, I am aspiring to start a PhD on peaceful revolutions in Africa. And I'm also quite active with the democratic movement in Uganda myself. So the last month has been very interesting around the elections, yes. And it continues to be very interesting. And I was active on the panel for innovation out of slums, because I'm very interested in the concept of waithood, how youth are in a situation that sometimes is portrayed as a situation of marginalization and being stuck. However, they're also very creative. So in that waithood, they're finding a lot of political, economical, and social solutions. So that's my background.
Thanks. And then I have someone registered who's appears in my screen at SPL. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, that's me. Hello, everybody.
Hi.
My name is Phyllis Livaha. I teach at Erasmus University College. I teach international relations and international law. And I do research in the area of women's rights, specifically on female circumcision. And I found out about these panels just when they were right in the middle. So I'm not presenting in any panels, just here to listen.
Yeah. Thanks. And then Gerard van der Bruinhorst is introducing himself through the chat. So we understand that perhaps it's not so easy for you to speak out loudly, but feel free to make a comment. And thanks for joining us. I'm quickly going to go back to Abir to see if he can switch on. Is he still there?
No,
Abir?
he's
Abir has
yeah, and yeah. Abir is a she.
Oh, there is Abir. There she is again.
Abir, can you?
Hey,
yeah.
Good to see you.
Sorry, I thought for some reason I thought you were a man, but apologies for that.
No problem. I'm PhD researcher in Leiden, and I'm working on water and the environment. That's why I'm so interested to attend the panel and to see other experience in Africa.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us, and I'm glad you managed to make yourself visible. It's always nice to see people, and it makes it easier also to remember the names. Harry, can you briefly introduce the panel?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Maya. Also on my behalf, a very warm welcome to all of you, and I would like to kick off by saying that my introduction also feels a bit like irony to talk about a panel that has to do with colonial heritage in relation to land questions in Africa, and the introduction is done by two white Dutch academics. But there's a reason for that, because the initiator of this panel, Professor Emeritus Lungisilan Sebeza from University of Cape Town, is currently not able to participate in this panel as a consequence of personal circumstances. So Maya and I are very sorry for that. First of all, because he has been a dear colleague for over so many years, and so we are sad that he can't be with us today. But at the same time, we hope we can at least take his legacy almost into this panel. The question that is at the heart of this panel is how researchers focusing on the ongoing land question in Africa, but given Lungisila's expertise, actually South or Southern Africa, and who would like or who want or who prefer to use the outcomes of their research for advocating, suggesting improvements for that state of affairs, so-called action researchers. How do they deal or cope with the criticism that their outright positioning in their research actually would maybe even corrupt their research integrity and challenges their integrity as intellectuals? And Lungisila has been a prime example of this, and he would have been the colleague that should have been introducing this panel to you, because he is the colleague who always has combined a very strong and meticulous focus on research, but always combining it with a strong activist take on it, and also using his research results for that reason. And so how to go about that? Is it possible to do that kind of research where your political position is not neutral, where you have taken sides, what does that mean for your research? Does it have to be challenged because of it, or does it come with different challenges? Is something like neutrality in this kind of research possible at all? And actually, Lungizile has always lived this theme of this panel. And for that reason, it was very appropriate, I think, that Lungizile got an honorary doctorate from the University of Leiden in 2020 for his lifelong work on the land question in South Africa. I think I leave it to Maya to explain about the presenters for today, but not after that. I once again welcome you all, and I'm happy that size doesn't matter, and that the number of people attending a panel do not indicate anything else than that we can have a very good conversation together. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harry. Yes, we had a number of people applying to present a paper on this panel from Ethiopia, from Congo, also from South Africa. Unfortunately, however, we lost. We didn't manage to keep in touch with them. I think it's because the whole panel changed, and so maybe there were some conflicts with dates. Because of course, all the panels were supposed to have taken place in December. So I'm afraid that on this panel, also the presenters will be two white people. Although the project that I'm going to present was one in which I collaborated with Harry, but also very much with Lungizile. So in that sense, he's also part of that presentation, even though I'm going to present on behalf of the project. So it's a real pity, but we hope that our presentations will give you some food for thought, and that we will have an interesting conversation in which we will be able to share experiences. I know that some of you have indicated that you are also dealing with this issue of how do you go about your own positionality. So I'm looking forward to discussing this with you. First, Harry will give his presentation. Then I have a lot of slides, but I will try and go through them very quickly because I want to leave enough time for a real exchange of ideas and experiences. So Harry, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Maya. And to the other participants in the panel, don't wait till I finish. Just interrupt, ask, shout, whatever you think is worthwhile to add, because we have time on our hands, so we can really take advantage of that. Okay, Daniel, do you have my PowerPoint ready? Thanks very much, Daniel, for assisting. Okay. Panel H45, Knowledge and Action, Reflections on Organizational Ethnographical Fieldwork in Zimbabwe. Was I an action researcher or not? Do I deserve that label? Can I claim that label? Will others put that label on my type of research? Let's see what it brings us. Next slide, please. It was all about a PhD and the one-year research that I did in Zimbabwe in 1998, together with the family that at that time consisted of my wife Marianne and 4 small children. By the way, 3 of whom we homeschooled during that year, so a kind of training for COVID times, you could say. It resulted in 2000 in a PhD thesis that you see on your left side, fighting over fences, organizational cooperation, and reciprocal exchange between the Save Valley Conservancy and its neighboring communities. Sorry, a bit of a long subtitle, but okay. First of all, maybe a bit of clarification on what the Private Wildlife Conservancy is. Basically, it is white farmers who pool their resources to create economies of scale in establishing a wildlife area. And in this particular case, in Zimbabwe, the Save Valley Conservancy, it was 23 farmers who pooled their land, took away internal fencing, and brought in, restocked the area with wildlife for a wildlife mode of production, for basically hunting. And as you can imagine, with 23 farmers, that was quite an area. If I would explain it to a Dutch audience, I could say, well, it's more or less the size of the province of Friesland. So you can imagine that it was quite a huge conservancy. At the time, 1998, it was considered the biggest in the world. The fighting over fences thesis was then later on kind of updated into a book for the African Studies series with Brill, and the title Private Wildlife Conservation in Zimbabwe, Joint Ventures and Reciprocity. But in between those two dates, so 2000 when I defended my thesis, and in 2003 when I published the book based on it, a lot happened in Zimbabwe. And actually, even in between the year 1998 when I did my fieldwork and 2000s, there were quite dramatic changes and upheavals in Zimbabwe that I will speak of in a second. But first, let us have a quick look at what the Conservancy looked like then and now. Daniel, can you please go for the next slide? So the Save Valley Conservancy, southeast corner of Zimbabwe, their logo, top left. They claim to have the biggest baobab in Zimbabwe, and actually of Southern Africa. I don't know how true or not true, because if I'm not mistaken, I think there's a similar claim also at the falls. So I don't know if it is really the biggest one, but at least they claim it. And by the looks of it, I mean it looks quite big anyway. On the right side, you see where in the southeast corner it is located. And if you look at the kind of perimeter of the Conservancy, that was what it was in 1998, and in between that time and now, all the more gray areas are now part of resettlement areas. So they were taken over or granted to land claimants. And that was for a reason, because like in South Africa, where Lungisila's research takes place most of the time, a huge uneven distribution of land in Zimbabwe, where a few whites appropriated basically the best land to the detriment of huge numbers of Zimbabweans who had to live on rather marginal lands. And so if you look at this particular conservancy, and if you look at the concept of a conservancy being a conglomerate of white farmers pooling their resources, it's interesting to know that there was, at the time that I did my research in 1998, there was not a single black farmer or otherwise involved. They were all what they would call white farmers. And this area had been also an area with a lot of struggle and warfare during the War for Independence in the 70s. And interestingly enough, the areas that were invaded, as it was called at the time, were also the areas of land that were incredibly contested during the War for Independence. So that is why you see it in the southern part of the conservancy, that most of the land is now resettled, while the northern part that is far less the case. So a huge difference between what I encountered in 1998 and what it has become now. But at the same time, also still going strong in some ways, that it at least it still exists, and it's also now kind of recognized by the Zimbabwean government, who hesitated for many years to really kind of judicially recognize conservancies in Zimbabwe, but by now they have done so. Can I have the next slide, please? So the land question in Zimbabwe, very much entangled, and I won't go into detail, but very much entangled with a lot of political tensions, and I couldn't resist myself almost to make use of one of my favorite cartoonists from South Africa, Sapiro, who is always, at least in my mind, accurate in kind of drawing cartoons on political realities in both South Africa, which is his home country, but also the neighbor, which is not a coincidence, because South Africa has played a significant role in what has happened to Zimbabwe in those years. As you can see from that cartoon, that there were tensions on many levels, on the level of press freedom, the farming sector, because what often happened was that the white commercial farmers defended their claims to land, with the claim that they were the only ones who would know how to really farm commercially in Zimbabwe, which Maya would explain is not the case. But for many years they made that claim. There were next to that, and of course, again, in entanglements that I won't go into right now, huge economic tensions. Actually, I use the word tensions here while I at some stage almost used the word meltdown. And certainly if you come to speak of the Zimbabwe dollar and the inflation that you see represented on this note, then you see that the word meltdown is maybe not as weird as it might seem at first, because if you have to print notes of $100 trillion, then you know there is something terribly wrong, and it has led to a situation where the Zimbabwe dollar just disappeared, was no longer accepted as currency, and that you had to pay in Zimbabwe with American dollars or with South African rands. But this land question was entangled with this whole kind of setup in many ways, sometimes almost rhetorically, but others that love to say that it was primarily primarily used rhetorically by Mugabe to stay in power, also kind of disregarded the incredible uneven division of land in Zimbabwe. So no matter how it was politically used, how it ruined the economy, the sheer fact remains that it was a very uneven distribution of land, and that no matter how well you were into the issue, it was never a question if it would erupt at some stage, but actually more the question when it would happen. And in 1998, and that is also how I end my thesis. I mean, I was not a wizard nor a clairvoyant to suggest that we were rather close to eruption, and that you could see it coming, and that is what happened, because at the time I was there were already land invasions, and they threw stones and branches of wood towards my car. So it was brewing like nothing else at the time. Please, next slide. In 1998, it was not yet as bad as I just sketched out on the basis of that cartoon and that banknote. It was brewing. You could see it coming, but it was not there yet. And I tried to do my best as a good researcher, a good ethnographer, to look into this conservancy of white farmers that really, no, maybe the word really is not appropriate, but that tried to come up with a joint venture with the neighboring communities. And so as a white male researcher from the Netherlands, I did most of my research amongst the white farmers in the conservancy, chaired by the award-winning conservationist Clive Stockhill. And if I'm not mistaken, it's Prince William that hands him the trophy. And why is this important to know? Because he won that award for being able to connect conservation with local communities. So it seemed that he was the ideal chairperson to chair this conservancy and to really make a joint venture with the neighboring communities work for the benefit of both. Neighboring communities on the right-hand side, represented by the rural district councils. And I tried to talk to them and be with them as much as I tried to be amongst the white farmers, to get a kind of even perspective on what was happening in that joint venture, because that was the kind of ultimate goal of the whole PhD. Remember, I'm in organization sciences, so organizational processes are very much at the heart of what we try to understand. And this particular joint venture, where a joint venture was tried between such opposite parties that had bombed each other out during the war for independence, and now all of a sudden tried to make something work in a joint venture, to me was like very interesting to find out if it would work, and what we could learn from it if such antagonistic parties would be able to make a joint venture work. Can I ask for the next slide, please? The joint venture between the Savi Valley Conservancy and the neighboring communities was actually inspired by the famous campfire program. Yeah, and I will go a bit faster, Maya. Thanks. For whom I, by the way, got a lot of inspiration before my PhD by talking to Maya about it, who had been in Zimbabwe before me and knew much more about all campfire than I did, and maybe even do. The basic idea, I won't go into this scheme, but the basic idea is that by the joint venture and by the hunting rewards that you could save part of that income to be redistributed among the local communities who are involved in this joint venture. As you can see, there is the problem, or let's say redistribution is done through the Rural District Council, and one of the problems, and Maya could tell you much more about it, is how money that ended up in the Rural District Council from campfire projects around the country in the end ended up in local communities. There was a lot happening in between the Rural District Council and the local community. So many had the feeling that not all the money that went into the Rural District Council to be redistributed amongst the communities indeed ended up in the communities. Okay, next slide, please, and I'm nearly done. If you would go to the website of the Save Valley Conservancy now, you would read the following. During the government of Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform program in 2000 and 2008, and remember, my fieldwork was in 1998, approximately 33% of Save Valley Conservancy was settled by subsistence farmers and 80 kilometers of perimeter fencing, etc. This mosaic creates conditions conducive to intense human-wildlife conflict, illegal hunting, and habitat destruction, essentially a microcosm of the key conservation threats facing wildlife in Africa. As a researcher, in 1998, I tried to understand what was happening in the joint venture. And on the one hand, I had the white farmers who basically were of the same thinking as is reflected in this quote. And on the other hand, were the neighboring communities that had their perspective on the land question, and who basically saw their opportunities politically when Mugabe was so much struggling to stay in power. And then to make up your mind, or that you kind of gear your analysis to do justice to that kind of antagonistic kind of forces in a joint venture, was a huge challenge. And I started by introducing this panel that I can't escape a sense of irony when introducing this panel as a white male from the Netherlands, because Zimbabwe has experienced and is experiencing incredible hard times politically, economically, with the new president Mnangagwa. I don't know if there's been much change since Mugabe, and the harsh realities on the ground I do no longer encounter myself as I was doing it in 1998. And still, I got my PhD, I got my title, and I still remember that I was at some stage at the Rural District Council, and the gentleman asked me, "So what are you going to do with those data, Harry? And are you just going back to the Netherlands, write your thesis, get your PhD, and go on with your career, and you leave us with this?" And in my car salesman mentality, of course, I said, no, that will not be the case. That will not be the case. No, I will stay real loyal to this land question and what kind of solutions that can be found. And look at me, 2021, and I present this case to a conference with a PhD, but I've hardly been back to Zimbabwe ever since. Thank you.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. And indeed, as you pointed out, I did my PhD in a different part of Zimbabwe, in the north, in a so-called communal area, among people who were taught to use their land more efficiently, when in fact they were using it very efficiently. And indeed, as you saw also in the slide, they were presented as subsistence farmers, which they were not, because they were also growing cash crops. And at that time were doing quite well. Unfortunately, my field work was also interrupted. I managed to go back. I did my PhD in the mid-1990s and managed to go back every year until 2002. And after that, it became way too dangerous for the people that I was interacting with. If they would receive me, they would immediately become suspect of selling out. So unfortunately, I was disconnected from people that I'd been doing research with for a long time. And like Harry, found that quite disturbing to be cut off from people that you've interacted with for such a long time. You know the families. You want to know what happened to the children who were then in school and now are adults. So quite disturbing. So thank you very much for that presentation. Danielle, can you, sorry, I should ask first, that's always the hard part about doing this online. Are there any questions for clarification? Because I thought perhaps it would be nice if we have the two presentations and then have a more general discussion. But if there are things about the presentation that you want to know more about that you didn't get, please raise your hand. There is is there a raise your hand or type
or just do it in your screen.
Yeah. Oh, there's Beatrice who's raised her hand. I'm trying to see if there are more people. Beatrice, go ahead.
Hey, Professor Harry, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question about the goal of your PhD thesis. Was your goal to be somehow politically involved in speaking with people, or that just naturally happened throughout your fieldwork experience?
Can you just repeat the last bit, because I think your microphone is not in front of your mouth?
Okay, I'm very sorry about that.
That's much better. Thanks very much. Yeah.
I'm very sorry about that. So I was just wondering if it was the goal during your PhD thesis and research to be politically involved with the people, or that just happened naturally throughout your fieldwork experience there?
I never thought of myself very much as a political activist. But if you do field work in such an intense way for a year that you live your research, basically, you are maybe not naturally, but quite automatically drawn into it. And that is where questions of integrity and all that come into play, because if we talk integrity here, what are we really referring to? To something like norms and standards of academic research? Has social justice anything to do with it? Yes or no? So I found that quite a complex issue, but I can't ignore that with hardly a kind of background in politics, not in the Netherlands or anywhere else, that in Zimbabwe and later in South Africa, I've become almost much more political than ever before.
Thanks. Anyone else who would like to? Oh, Eric has his hand up. Eric, please go ahead.
Yes, I have to leave earlier, so I wanted to pose the question already before the second presentation. I find the ending of what Harry was telling us also very interesting, because I was there at the introduction session of Africa Knowledge Conference in the beginning of the year. And then I remember that we had all these insights and all these brilliant ideas, but then there were also some diaspora, African diaspora present at the conference, and they asked for guidance after one of the speakers. But then the speaker said, I'm an academic, so I'm more observing. I'm observing and trying to learn, but I'm not aware of the full, what's the right path to take or the right direction. And then I found something interesting, because I'm struggling with this myself. And then I heard the term action researcher for the first time, because to me it seems that action and researching, that it seems that the norm at this moment is that academics should be observing, but that it's dangerous for them if they get involved or too active. Personally, I'm quite active within Uganda, and then you have this democratic struggle, and I've been from doing research, becoming more political activist. I'm always balancing between those two sides. But I often hear from people looking at what I'm doing that I should not be taking this action side, because as a researcher, I should be objective and neutral. So I get a lot of feedback or tips from, please don't be so active, because you are supposed to be a researcher. So I find this a very interesting debate about, because when you think about integrity, social justice, when you see injustice happening, as a human, you might want to help or do something. So I find this very interesting. And the last thing, maybe it could also have to do something with reverse colonialism, that because of colonialism and the role we played, we are now a bit too afraid, because we're from Europe, to we see each other as Europeans and Africans instead of humans. So I'm still finding out what's the answer.
Yeah, thanks, Eric, for this question, and I think that also others can have their own answers to this question, because the same holds for Maya, the same holds for Ton, and maybe on another level also for others. The question maybe is also if academia is the right place for political activism. And some may say yes, because you are ideally positioned to do your homework properly, and no, and therefore can indeed position yourself politically based on more kind of grounded research. But I know also of quite some academics that find the academic milieu quite constraining for their activism, and that is with regard to human politics, so to speak. But I'm also quite familiar with some other branches of activism where it has to do with animals, for instance, and that the kind of constraints that academia and academic research norms put on you are a barrier to really speak out on issues. And I think that also counts for the kind of research that you yourself are doing, and how you are drawn in between the one and the other. I don't know how Maya and Ton think about it, but I think it is a hard nut to crack, I must say. And while Ton, for instance, is coming, of course, from an age where political activism was almost the same as being an academic. So maybe he could say a few words on this.
I propose that we do that after Marja.
Okay.
Yeah, and
hold your fire.
My presentation speaks to some of these questions. So Erik, because there is indeed this ambiguity, and that's been strengthened by some recent developments, which, if there are no further questions, let me just go through the gallery to see if anyone is raising a hand. No. Danielle, can you start my presentation? Yes. So, and can you go to the next slide, please? Because there are indeed these tensions, and this sort of, on the one hand, warning scientists not to be overly political, but at the same time, we are increasingly asked to act on the societal relevance of our research. And so we're supposed to contribute to solutions of problems, but we're supposed to do that in a rather neutral way. And that is what my presentation is about. We see increasingly that when we apply for research funding, we are supposed to do that through consortia, in which we also invite societal partners to participate, often requiring the direct involvement of NGOs and also private sector organizations. And then we are, I'm sorry to hear that.
Thanks for joining us.
Phyllis, but thanks for joining us. And then what we are supposed to do is actually bring all these different stakeholders together through some kind of multi-stakeholder engagement platform. And then we share our knowledge, and then the problem gets solved. And of course, we're also supposed to create our research agenda in close cooperation with these stakeholders. Can I have the next slide, please? But that is kind of, it's based on rather naive assumptions about the link between science and policy. It's based on this idea that the scientists deliver the right kind of information, and then the policymakers come up with the right kind of policies. And of course, that completely ignores the political aspects and the aspects of the interests that are solved in power relations. And a lot of these multi-stakeholder approaches actually mask power abuse and structural inequality, because by bringing together all the stakeholders and then coming up with solutions, those stakeholders who are more marginalized will find it more difficult to get their ideas and across and their interest represented. But because they have been part of these multi-stakeholder engagements, they're supposed to have agreed to with the solutions. And so actually there are more and more authors who are questioning these assumptions about the multi-stakeholder platforms, saying that these are not neutral spaces for negotiation. And the idea of these multi-stakeholder platforms is also often that, there's a need to work towards a consensus. And many scholars who've also been active in these kinds of approaches say, well, sometimes it's not feasible, and sometimes consensus may not be desirable either, because it often means that you favor more powerful actors over more marginalized actors, and you need to be very aware of these conflicting interests and the conflicting positions. Also, another point of critique is that these stakeholder engagements are sort of isolated from other strategies, like, for instance, land occupations, which were dubbed invasions by the white farmers in Zimbabwe. But these are important strategies, and actually, as researchers, we should also engage with these kinds of strategies, and not necessarily by invading or occupying ourselves, but at least by documenting why people engage in these actions, in these strategies. And there's sort of this idea that in these multi-stakeholder platforms, we should focus on communication, because a lot of the problems are caused by poor communication. But that fails to take into account that miscommunication and withholding of information may actually be a very deliberate strategy deployed by some of the stakeholders. Can I have the next slide, please? So a lot of these stakeholder engagements we are supposed to engage with societal partners, but the ways that are often prescribed by the funders, and this happens through, well, in our case, in the project that I'm going to discuss, we were supposed to fill out a log frame, which is sort of the development organization method to show how, what the consequences will be of all the aspects of all the different parts of your project. Nowadays, it's a theory of change, in which you have to discuss what kind of data you need, what you will do with the findings, and how those findings can be translated into either new practices or in better policies. But that's quite a technocratic kind of conceptualization of democracy, and very much focuses on the importance of knowledge, and proper knowledge, expert-driven knowledge that actually can marginalize the agency of ordinary people and also renders them more or less invisible. And so, as researchers, I think it's very important that we pay attention to, in both our research, but also in our engagement with stakeholders, to procedural, distributional, and intergeneration equity. So very much the call that Harry also launched, that social justice does matter, and so we have to look at at equity issues. And it also means that we have to continuously reflect on relationship with all the stakeholders, including with our fellow researchers on the project, to see where we stand, how that may influence indeed our research, but also our relations with the stakeholders in these multi-stakeholder engagements. And sometimes, actually, we may need to engage strategically in alliances to make sure, at least that's my view, that we have to make sure as researchers that the disadvantaged and marginalized groups can actively participate in these multi-stakeholder engagements. At the same time, the rest of my presentation is going to show you how incredibly difficult that may turn out to be in practice. Can I have the next slide? It also means that we have to deal with different kinds of knowledges. Do we, and there's in the ideas about co-creation, there's also an emphasis on the need to incorporate practitioners' knowledge, local and indigenous knowledge. And the figure on the right-hand corner is from an article I co-authored with colleagues also in the natural sciences, about where we try to develop an approach of how do we combine all these different forms of knowledge without using one form of knowledge to validate the other form of knowledge. And we wrote that as a response to calls also by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, where they were also struggling with this idea, and where often also natural scientists find it very hard to not sort of try to validate which local and indigenous knowledge is correct and which knowledge isn't. But that also means that you have to present you have to present the various sources of knowledge in ways that other actors can understand. So it also has to do with validity, with legibility. And of course, when we discuss these multi-stakeholder engagements, we also have to consider the question of, who is considered local and a stakeholder, and different societal partners may have different ideas about that. Sometimes you see stakeholders being included at various levels who have an influence on local conditions, whereas some of the people who are subjected to that influence are, for one reason or another, excluded, or powerful actors try to exclude those from multi-stakeholder engagements. Can I have the next slide, please? And it's interesting to see that both Harry and I used the fence indeed as a symbol of the project. And this was a project in which Harry was involved also, and Lungisile Nsebeza, and our colleague Shirley Brooks as well. So it was a collaboration with the University of the Free State and the University of Cape Town. And this was a project in which we wanted to study the socioeconomic impacts of conversions to game farming. And so these are, again, mainly white farmers who shift from conventional agriculture, so crop farming, livestock farming, to game farming. And game farming can take on different forms. So it can be sort of ecotourism, game viewing. There are also farms that specialize in hunting. And there are also breeding farms where wildlife is being bred to be sold off to other game farms. And we wanted to study the impact of those conversions on a specific group, farm dwellers, and that in itself was already a political choice that we made. Can I have the next slide, please? Because when we started, a lot of people said that we should look mainly at, the economic gains of game farming and sort of assume a trickle-down effect to farm workers. And we said, no, we really want to look more in detail at these farm workers and how they experience these conversions and how they respond. And that was, as I already mentioned, quite a political choice. I'll try and quickly present a very complicated history, because the reason we focused on this group is that, of course, there's a very racially skewed distribution of land access in South Africa as well. Only 13% of all agricultural land was allocated to the Black population, and often in the more infertile areas. Of course, South Africa under apartheid had set apart, but built on colonial processes, had set apart specific areas for certain tribes as their homeland, and people could only travel to the rest of South Africa provided they had a pass, they had a job, etc. And so there was very strict control of movement. But in these so-called European areas of South Africa, in these areas that were allocated to white farmers, farm workers and tenants were present. And for this group of people, and they were sort of left behind after land was confiscated, they were left behind as farm workers, often also as tenants, labor tenants. For many white farmers, it was much more advantageous to allocate land to people who would, in return for that land, work part of the year on the white-owned farm. And so for this group, the farm is both a workplace and a home. Although the history and how this evolved differs between the various regions in Zimbabwe, in South Africa. I'm saying Zimbabwe, but we have very similar systems there. And another issue that's important to know is that in the early days of the settlement of these white farmers, it was very difficult for them to recruit labor. Also because a lot of black farmers switched to production for the market and used that income to pay taxes, and they didn't want to work under these very disadvantageous conditions. And so offering land was also a way of recruiting people, but over the years with a lot of subsidy from the apartheid government and the introduction of a lot of mechanization, there was a increased redundancy of laborers. And so prior to 1994, the switch to the abolishment of apartheid, a lot of farm workers already lost their jobs. And this development was accelerated after 1994 with the continuation of the deregulation of the agrarian sector, so the abolishment of protection of the sector, abolition of subsidies, etc. But at the same time, so while farmers had to compete in a global market with very little government support, at the same time there were attempts made to regulate the labor conditions on of farm workers. And some attempts were also made to secure the land rights of farm workers and former labor tenants, because these farms were often the only places in South Africa where people had access to land. And so it's in this context that we need to analyze these impacts of the conversions to game farming. Can I have the next slide, please? And please, Harry, intervene if you think I'm taking too long. And so when we started the research, there was this very dominant narrative that these conversions would result in win-win, and that this was good for nature conservation, as it would increase the habitat for wildlife, but it would also result in more jobs, job opportunities. And in fact, what we discovered is that because most of these game farms, so either individual farmers bid by bid buy out their neighbors, or they pool the land together with their neighbors, as Harry described in this for the Save Valley Conservancy, or they enlist the help of investors. And so most of these game farms actually, they eat up neighboring farms, include them to have a larger space for wildlife. And so if you ask the individual farm owner or farm manager whether he, in most cases it is a he, fired people, he will say no, I hired additional people. But what they don't take into account is that actually on all these farms incorporated in the one game farm, there were people working. And so if you look at the total number of jobs available before the conversion, after conversion, in most cases, there's a loss of employment opportunities. And in some provinces, we also see that the authorities are really reluctant to give back farms to land claimants, so people who were evicted from these areas under apartheid. or under colonial rule, because these farms are now considered to be nature conservation areas. But this varies very much from province to province. But overall, we see that it doesn't change the movement from farm workers, farm dwellers off farms into informal settlements, as the one depicted on the right, where people live in self-built shacks in the countryside, sort of squashed between all these game farms. Can I have the next slide, please? And so it was in this context that we started the research project, and that we also started our engagement with the various stakeholders. And when we prepared the project proposal, we were in touch with, we invited other academics apart from the colleagues that we started the project with. And we were inspired to do this project because we saw all these fences being erected in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of 2.5 meter high fences. And so we had invited a number of colleagues. We also, at that point, we could not get in touch with farm dwellers directly yet, because they're very difficult to access, because they live and work on other people's lands. And so you have to, in most cases, get permission from farm owners to get access to people. But we did invite,
Sorry to interrupt, but we are running out a bit of time.
I see. Yep. It's, I saw you sent me a private, okay. And so I'll just try and make it brief. And so we asked a number of NGOs who were representing farm dwellers in court cases, demonstrations, etc. And we also invited game farmers, more specifically the organizations that represent game farmers' interest in negotiations with government. And so both the NGOs representing farm dwellers and the game farmers said that, oh, this is a great project. The NGOs said, oh, this is a great project. You're going to prove that this is disastrous, that this is resulting in even more evictions of farm dwellers. Great that you're doing this. And the game farmers said, oh, this is a wonderful project. You are going to prove that this is the solution to the problems of the countryside in South Africa. You are going to show that this is win-win. So from the get-go, it was clear that we could not satisfy all of the stakeholders. And of course, as Harry says, when you do this kind of research, and we had quite a group of PhD students and master students doing research, and we also did some research ourselves. As anthropologists and social scientists, you are present in the field. So your daily research practices also involve interactions with the various stakeholders. At the end of the project, we also organized, so in addition to these different engagements, and we had a few midterm seminars also we organized, but at the end we also had a couple of multi-stakeholder workshops to discuss our findings with the various stakeholders. And what we tried to do, can I have the next slide, please? Was that, okay, next slide, sorry. Well, so what we tried to do is we started out in the Eastern Cape, and in the Eastern Cape, the position of farm workers, farm dwellers on the farms was already quite precarious, much more so than in KwaZulu-Natal. And so people were really afraid to lose their jobs if they were seen talking to us. So we also approached a lot of people outside of the farms in the townships where they often visit their relatives over the weekend. And so what we tried to do was start off with separate workshops for the farm dwellers, hoping that we would be able to recruit a group of people who we could sort of support in then voicing their concerns at these larger multi-stakeholder engagements. And so we organized a workshop in the township over the weekend in the local community center. But even in that case, we failed to recruit farm workers because people were so afraid to lose their job that they even didn't dare to go to this workshop in the township. And we had offered to provide transport because we knew that was an issue too. So we had really tried to mobilize people, but people were so afraid. But they did send sort of relatives. So they sent delegates. So they had the relatives who came with notebooks and all kinds of questions to us. And we had people from a local NGO who had managed to set up a farm worker committee in another part of the province. And they also responded and offered help. But our intention of creating this group of well-voiced, well-prepared farm workers to participate in the multi-stakeholder workshop unfortunately failed. We had a local one local workshop at a local museum in which we also invited local game farmers. And we had a workshop at one of the universities where we had also invited people from government. And what we noticed was that it was very difficult, that apparently white farmers felt so threatened in their position that they tried to completely dominate this workshop. Did not want NGO people to speak out. They accused us of doing sloppy work because we weren't using the right figures, because they were creating more employment opportunities, and they were completely unwilling to discuss this. And we also noted that they were mainly supported by government people who bought this win-win story, hook, line, and sinker, even though some of them during the break told us that, well, maybe you're right. But we can't say this because they don't have many other options because unemployment is a huge problem in the area. All I say about the workshop in KwaZulu-Natal. Can I have the next slide, please? And then I'm done, Harry. So next slide, please. Next, sorry. Yeah, so we also organized a multi-stakeholder workshop in KwaZulu-Natal. And there we also tried to start with this sort of single stakeholder workshop. But when we proposed that, actually the farm workers said, no, we want to confront the game farmers. We want to confront government. We don't want a separate workshop. And at this workshop, we noted that the levels of violence in that province were much higher. So in the workshop, we had white farmers who had very violently evicted farm workers from a game farm. So they had driven through the houses with pickup trucks, set houses on fire, put people on the back of the pickup truck and just dumped them in a township. But we also had one game farmer whose father had been murdered by a farm dweller in a conflict over land. And so in the province, the tensions were much higher, but at the same time, that kind of resulted in a more even situation. So white farmers did not dare to dominate the workshop that much. I must say we were also helped a lot by a translator who was very good also at connecting people. And so farm workers did get an opportunity to voice their concerns. That doesn't mean that their interests were completely taken at heart. What we also noted was that they found sort of a common enemy, or two rather. So one was the state, who was not who was accused of not dealing with the land issue properly and stalling land reform programs, so that everyone was kept in limbo. Sorry. And the other common enemy was capital. So white family farmers saying that, it was capital that was responsible for the destruction of family farms, and that also forced them to enter into the production of wildlife, and that capital was was influencing them as much as the farm workers, and that it was also capital that was responsible for them evicting people because they were because they had to make sure that their farms were productive, and that meant downsizing labor. And so there was much more communication, but still sort of deflected the real issues at stake in South Africa. And so many of us, after the project officially ended, continued to engage with farmers, with farm workers, but also with government. But we noted that it was very, very difficult to challenge that very dominant win-win narrative. Every now and then we get a request for a report and a comment, and people say, "Oh, but your research showed it wasn't win-win. Can you explain?" But it's a very dominant narrative that's very, very difficult to influence. And here I would like to end my presentation. And sorry it took so long.
Thanks. Would you like to chair your own Q&A, or shall I chair?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Marja, for this wonderful presentation. And I enjoyed the photographs very much as well, for old time's sake. Thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
I see that Ton has...
Yeah, he's going straight up.
Yeah.
Ton, please.
More a point of order, because this session was supposed to be up till 3:15 in the Netherlands, at least.
Oh.
Now it's much beyond. And... for myself, I can say that I'm a bit stressed in time. So,
okay.
For the discussion, we really, and this deserves a much longer discussion, but I'm afraid I don't have much time for that.
No, okay. Would you like to ask a question, or because if you have to go, that you at least have asked your question?
Sure. Both stories make it very clear that being an action researcher or being forced to be an action researcher is a very complicated thing. And the problem is also that many researchers who are doing research without wanting to be an action researcher become, in a way, an action researcher and are not really well prepared for doing that. So my first recommendation to everyone is there are quite good books now on being an action researcher. And I think there should be much more emphasis in training of students and researchers, discussing these things beforehand so that you're prepared how to manage that.
Yeah.
And so that's one observation. The second observation is, as Marja rightfully said, for every researcher in say, social, political, socioeconomic situations, it is important to know who the stakeholders are, and then trying to find out what the identities are of stakeholders, or what the conceptual ideas are behind these identities in itself is already political. Very often, you're supposed to use the classifications that are normal in a certain area or normal in your field of study, while it always marginalizes some people. And making those people visible, or making some people heard who are never being heard, is already action research. many researchers experience that by asking questions or by selecting certain people to answer your questions, and people who were never asked before, is already an act in itself. So being aware that you give voice to people who are normally voiceless is a political act. Being aware of the fact that these people, while becoming part of a research, also become researchers themselves and start thinking, start discussing, and these things can't be managed. So many action researchers have a rather schematic idea about, okay, we do this and then this follows. In practice, there's a lot of unknown and a lot of things happening afterwards of which you as a researcher are not aware. And that for me has always been an ethical dilemma. Because you really create insights, you create problems also in communities by asking questions, by doing the things you do. And you're often not there to be part of solutions or be part of negotiations. And that is certainly a problem for foreign researchers. As Harry said, I'm not there when things really went wrong. So,
yeah.
But it's then important also for local researchers. And then you enter this very problematic thing that very often local researchers can't do the things that foreign researchers you can, in terms of action research. Also because local researchers are much less protected, and also not by their own university staff. For foreigners, you always, if things go wrong, you can always go back to your country of origin, or you can always ask embassies to step in for you. For local researchers, that is much more difficult. And that game you play also in the relationship with your colleagues, researchers from local areas is a very problematic one and doesn't get a lot of attention in our teaching, I think.
Yeah, I think, Tom, you're absolutely right. And we did sometimes make use of the insider-outsider issue, although, of course, South Africa is not as dangerous a place to do research as Zimbabwe. We did indeed find that it was easier for the white students, the European students, to have access to all parties. For the African students, it was much more difficult to get access to game farms. And indeed, what happens afterwards, we were very conscious that we did not want to damage the reputation, that we did not want to damage the most marginal groups in the research, that we really, if people did not want to come to the workshops, if people did not want to be seen with us, we respected that. And we talked about how to protect the people who participated in our research. We also, sometimes also, it was also interesting because one of the NGOs requested that we handed them over the raw data, including all the names of the white farmers so they could sue them, which was also unethical because we got the interviews promising people anonymity. And so we said, no, that's out of the question. We will inform you about, the mechanisms that white farmers use to evict people. And those mechanisms tell you, give you information and give you leverage points to act. But indeed, and what people do with because of course there's a tendency on all sides to sort of try and use your findings to further their interest. And about, identifying stakeholders. And I think that's the main issue with this idea of co-creating research agendas, because that means that you have to identify the stakeholders before your project starts. And you may not know all the stakeholders and you may not know who's marginalized. So actually this idea of co-creation, and then of course, NWO also makes you co-create in sort of 2 afternoons and that's it, which of course is also quite ridiculous. But actually, you need to do a very thorough stakeholder and political analysis before you start the co-creating.
Yeah. But is it to a certain extent not almost ridiculous that we think that research can stay out of politics? I mean, the type of topics that have our interest, the kind of people we want to talk to, the kind of documents we are after, all taken together. How could you ever imagine that would not be considered political, or that you can indeed do an analysis outside political kind of relations? No, please.
No. I think, I mean, as I explained, our research question was already considered political.
Yeah.
Because we focused on,
so it is not a choice, is it? It is not a choice.
Anyone else? I'm trying to look at the gallery to see if anyone is raising a hand. Yeah. I agree. At the same time, I must also say that we had one person on the team who was so politically involved with the farm dwellers that also, I remember that, for instance, we also wanted to know, why did government buy the win-win narrative? And so we looked into how policymakers, how politicians responded to that. And that was sort of, this person didn't want to know about that because that was considered to be ANC bashing. And that was... And that's not you still have to remain open to all kinds of information. So that is, and also question your own assumptions all the time. That's very important. At the same time, choosing sides is inevitable also because, and that's something that I try to discuss with my students too, but is not always done, is that sometimes, there are certain stakeholders, certain people in your field that you really dislike. and people that you immediately sort of...
Yeah. Abir, do you want to ask a question? Because that's why you turned your camera on, probably. Yes, please.
Yeah.
It is very interesting. It is very interesting. And it's, come back for... with your last comment about there are people who you dislike in the field work when you are interviewing. And this is my question. Did you challenge your interviewee, especially who are from the powerful side, not the community? Because who make me nervous usually the technocrats, the technical experts. And especially I remembered one incident that one of technical experts said that I know the future because I know what is the climate change impacts on the community. So my design for water project is better than what is the community is needed. So at that point, I couldn't reply. I couldn't respond to him. It put me in a block. It's what are you saying? And you're supposed to be a social and the environment assessment director. So this is the mentality and narrative, like win-win situations. There is a mentality of future narrative. How to deal with this one.
Yeah. And this is, I think, there was also Derksen and de Bock wrote about very similar ideas also in the Netherlands. I did. My idea is that I always first try to let the people I interview speak and let them say whatever they want. And of course, people also ask you what you feel. So I do, after I let them speak, I do ask them, but what about this? What about that? So I do try to challenge them. Also to see, and people also contradict themselves. I mean, we also had white farmers who, a person I interviewed, and then first he said, oh yeah, but it's not fair. We subjugated people for 3 centuries, and now we suddenly expect them to become productive farmers in less than 20 years. 5 minutes later, he makes another horribly racist remark about these people. So people are also contradicting themselves. But I do engage in conversations, and I do challenge them also, because I don't want to pretend I'm different, and that's also not fair. If you engage if you don't engage in a discussion and then you write in your article, it becomes very clear that you're negative about, that you don't agree with these points of view. I think it's also part of your integrity to make that known. But Ton also wants to respond to that, I see.
Sure. One of my experiences is that it really matters if in a community that you're doing research among, there is a culture of open discussions or cultural silence.
Yeah.
And also in many situations, the way of meeting people, even if all stakeholders are together, is very often dominated by ritual type of meetings in which it's self-evident who is talking and who should be silent. Yeah. Now, if that is a problem for your research, and I think it should be a problem for your research, then you have to design methods to separate groups of people, yeah, to make them talk among themselves, going away from these rituals of being silent. And that is particularly strong if communities deal with patriarchy and with the fact that women are supposed to be silent and men, particularly elderly men, talk. So then you always have to separate the male groups from the female groups. But what is also very often important is separate the ones with a position of authority to people who are supposed not to be in authority. So make sure that people can speak out. And even then, if you do that, the culture of silence in some communities might mean that they won't speak out because they know from generation to generation that speaking out can be dangerous for them. So making the research conditions for them to talk open and democratic and inviting already is a big challenge in many communities. And sometimes certainly doesn't work because already for 100 years, it's known by people that if they speak out now and can do that in safe circumstances, 2 years later, things might be different and people will remember what they have been saying in these meetings. So it's a tricky thing, and it's also a major responsibility for researchers to know these cultures of speaking out and cultures of silence and these rituals of these meetings.
Yeah, well, it was interesting, Ton, that in Eastern Cape we tried to do exactly that, create a safe space for farm dwellers, but even there they didn't feel safe enough. So
it's clear that we had this experience in the PADEF research, the participatory assessment of development, that worked as a method in a fantastic way in northern Ghana and southern Burkina Faso, later also appeared to work in a fantastic way in Kenya and in Benin. And when we used exactly the same methods in South Africa, we were really dealing with a wall of silence. Mm. Even when you create safe spaces, people simply don't talk. They simply wait and see, and others should do the talking. And that was, for me, it was a big confrontation, because certainly for South Africa, I had expected, and it was the South Africa of, 2002, 2003. So you would expect people to be open, but not at all.
Yeah, well, except in KwaZulu-Natal, which was really interesting. Fernanda raises an issue in the chat. And she's saying that the boundaries between action, research, and politics are very tenuous, do not really exist. But she reminds us of also of the issue that perhaps we should not be partisan, that we should be aware of, that the boundaries are blurred. but that we are also supposed to be not partisan. Thanks, Fernanda. I think that's very important. And I think that's what I also tried to say when I said that it shouldn't result in you not looking for certain of information or withholding certain information, like, not wanting to look into why government supports game farmers rather than farm dwellers. But I think sometimes it's still difficult because people will accuse you of being partisan if you just by asking certain questions.
Yeah. Okay. Final burning questions, comments, anything else? Otherwise, before giving the floor to Maya to say something in closing, I just wanted to pay homage to Lungusila. Maya, you can remember that one. Yes. This was one of the outcomes of us working together with Lungusila, and we both feel really sad that he isn't present on this particular panel, because he would have enlightened us with a lot of more analysis and stories than we can offer. But for that reason, Marja, floor is yours.
Well, thanks. And I'm really sorry we went over time, even though most of our speakers canceled. Although we must say, if they had been here, we would have gladly sacrificed our presentations. Perhaps we were also a bit slow because these are complicated issues, but we also thought, only 2 presentations, plenty of time. Thank you very much for being here. And indeed, we miss Lungusila, and we will update him. And thanks for your questions. We would have loved to spend at least another half hour discussing this with you and hearing more also from Abir, from Beatrice, from everyone present here. But thanks for your contributions, and it also helps us to remain sharp and reflect on the ways forward.
Yeah, and thanks, Daniel, for your technical support.
Yes, thanks, Daniel.
Went very smooth. And would you like to say something in Portuguese to Beatrice?
Prazer, Beatriz. Obrigado por ter participado. Boa sorte nos seus estudos.
Obrigada, Daniel, pelo seu trabalho e muito obrigada pelo desejo de boa sorte a bem seguido.
E já éramos 3 a falar português nesta mesa.
Nanda também.
Okay.
Cabo Verde.
Thank you very much, all of you. Obrigado.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Bye.
Yeah, hope to see you at another session.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.